Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The podcast studio in Baltimore fell into an unusual silence as Gervonta Davis stared at the microphone, his hands fidgeting with the water bottle before him. The bright lights seemed harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows across his face as he prepared to share something that had haunted him for years. The interviewer, sensing the weight of the moment, leaned forward expectantly, while thousands of listeners waited through their headphones and speakers worldwide. Gervonta's mind drifted back to that humid evening in Las Vegas, 3 years ago, when the boxing world had gathered for another spectacular fight night. The atmosphere backstage buzzed with the familiar energy of champions, trainers, and promoters moving through the maze of dressing rooms and corridors. He had been riding high on his latest knockout victory, his confidence soaring as reporters and fans clamored for his attention. That night, Manny Pacquiao had been scheduled to meet with several young fighters as part of a mentorship initiative. The legendary Filipino boxer, already in the twilight of his career, had made it his mission to guide the next generation of champions. Word had spread through the venue that the 8-division world champion wanted to spend time with rising stars, sharing wisdom earned through decades of triumph and heartbreak. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Remedios, had approached Gervonta with genuine excitement in her eyes. She explained how Manny had specifically requested to meet him, having watched his recent performances with admiration. The offer was simple: 30 minutes of private conversation with one of boxing's greatest legends, away from cameras and crowds, just two fighters sharing their love for the sport. Gervonta remembered the exact moment when pride transformed into arrogance. He had just finished an interview where journalists praised his devastating power and undefeated record. The adrenaline of victory mixed with the intoxicating whispers of being the future of boxing. When Remedios extended Manny's invitation, something shifted inside him. He convinced himself that he had already surpassed the need for guidance from previous generations. The dismissal came swift and cold. Gervonta told Remedios that he was too busy, that his schedule was packed with more important meetings. He claimed that learning from past champions would only limit his unique style and natural instincts. The coordinator's face fell slightly, but she maintained her professional composure, nodding politely before walking away to deliver the disappointing news. Meanwhile, in the adjacent building, Manny sat quietly in a simple chair, still wearing his traditional barong Tagalog, the embroidered Filipino shirt that connected him to his roots. He had been looking forward to the conversation, remembering his own journey from the streets of General Santos to boxing immortality. The champion had prepared stories about overcoming poverty, about the importance of humility in success, about how boxing could be a bridge between cultures and communities. When Remedios returned with Gervonta's response, Manny simply smiled and nodded. There was no anger or disappointment in his expression, only the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed countless young fighters struggle with the weight of early success. He asked Remedios to convey his best wishes to Gervonta anyway, hoping that their paths might cross again under different circumstances. That evening, while Gervonta celebrated with his entourage at an exclusive after-party, Manny spent time with other young boxers who had eagerly accepted his invitation. He shared meals with them, listened to their dreams and fears, and offered guidance that would shape their careers for years to come. The legendary fighter spoke about respect, about honoring those who paved the way, and about the responsibility that comes with talent. Now, sitting in the podcast studio, Gervonta finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost that night. The realization hit him like a perfectly timed counterpunch, leaving him breathless as he prepared to share his story with the world. The podcast studio remained heavy with anticipation as Gervonta continued his revelation, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there in his earlier interviews. The host watched as the young champion's composure shifted, revealing vulnerability beneath the carefully constructed persona of invincibility. Across social media platforms, fans were already sharing clips of the ongoing confession, sensing that something profound was unfolding in real time. Gervonta's memory pulled him deeper into that Las Vegas night, but now he focused on details he had been too proud to notice at the time. After dismissing Manny's invitation, he had wandered through the venue's corridors, basking in the congratulations and praise from his growing entourage. Every handshake and compliment fed his ego, reinforcing his belief that he had already transcended the need for guidance from boxing's older generation. Yet something nagged at him throughout the evening. As he moved through the crowd, he began overhearing conversations about Manny's interactions with other young fighters. A trainer named Teodoro spoke enthusiastically about how the Filipino legend had spent 40 minutes with his amateur boxer, sharing insights about footwork that had taken years to master. A cutman named Inigo described watching Manny demonstrate hand-wrapping techniques that maximized both protection and power. The stories multiplied as the night progressed. Gervonta learned that Manny had invited a group of junior welterweights to join him for a late dinner at a modest Filipino restaurant off the Strip. The champion had personally paid for everyone's meals, while sharing stories about his early career struggles in General Santos City. He spoke about sleeping in gymnasiums, about training with makeshift equipment, about the hunger that drove him to become great, not just for himself but for his entire nation. What struck Gervonta most painfully was hearing about Manny's genuine interest in each fighter's background. The legendary boxer had asked detailed questions about their families, their training environments, their dreams beyond boxing. He offered practical advice about managing finances, about staying connected to their roots despite fame and fortune, about the importance of giving back to their communities. Meanwhile, Manny had returned to his hotel room that night with the same peaceful demeanor he carried everywhere. He sat on the edge of his bed, still wearing his traditional barong Tagalog, and spent time in quiet reflection. The rejection from Gervonta hadn't wounded his pride, but it had stirred memories of his own youth when he sometimes struggled to accept guidance from those who had walked similar paths before him. The Filipino champion understood that wisdom couldn't be forced upon anyone. He had learned through experience that some lessons could only be absorbed when a fighter was ready to receive them. His own journey included moments of stubbornness and pride that had temporarily closed his mind to valuable insights from trainers and mentors. Gervonta's voice cracked slightly as he continued his podcast revelation, describing how the following months had unfolded. He had watched from afar as several of the fighters who met with Manny that night began implementing subtle changes to their training and approach. Their performances improved noticeably, displaying new levels of ring intelligence and tactical awareness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere physical preparation. The young champion began researching Manny's career more intensively, studying fights he had previously dismissed as outdated. He discovered layers of strategic brilliance that his youthful arrogance had prevented him from appreciating. The Filipino's ability to adapt his style across multiple weight divisions, his unwavering composure under pressure, his capacity to find victory even when facing seemingly impossible odds. These qualities represented exactly the kind of wisdom Gervonta now realized he desperately needed. As months passed, the missed opportunity grew heavier in his mind. He began reaching out through intermediaries, hoping to arrange another meeting, but Manny's schedule had become increasingly demanding with political responsibilities and final boxing commitments. The window that had been freely offered was now frustratingly closed. The podcast audience could hear the subtle change in Gervonta's breathing as he delved deeper into his confession. His manager, sitting in the corner of the studio, shifted uncomfortably, knowing this level of vulnerability was unprecedented for the usually guarded champion. Social media notifications buzzed constantly on nearby phones as boxing fans around the world began sharing the unfolding revelation, sensing they were witnessing something that would reshape how they viewed both fighters. Gervonta's narrative moved forward to 8 months after that fateful Las Vegas night. He had just suffered his first professional knockdown against a crafty veteran who had exploited a defensive gap that better preparation might have prevented. The moment of impact had sent shockwaves through the boxing world, but more personally, it had shattered Gervonta's sense of invincibility. As he lay on the canvas for those crucial seconds, staring up at the arena lights, one thought pierced through the chaos of his stunned mind. He wondered what Manny would have taught him about defensive positioning. The recovery from that knockdown had been successful. Gervonta had rallied to win the fight, but the psychological impact lingered far beyond the final bell. In the weeks that followed, he found himself obsessively studying footage of Manny's defensive techniques, particularly how the Filipino legend had managed to avoid devastating power punches throughout his career. The subtle head movements, the timing of his exits, the way he used his shoulders to deflect incoming shots. These details represented a masterclass that Gervonta now desperately wished he could have learned firsthand. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in General Santos City, Manny continued his daily routine with the same humble dedication that had defined his entire career. The legendary boxer woke before dawn each morning, not for training sessions anymore, but to spend time in quiet reflection and prayer. His modest home, unchanged despite decades of financial success, remained a sanctuary where he could connect with the values his mother, Dionysia, had instilled in him during their years of poverty. Manny's morning walks through his old neighborhood had become a source of inspiration for local youth. Children would follow him respectfully as he moved through the familiar streets, their faces filled with admiration for their hometown hero. He would stop at small shops and street vendors, purchasing items he didn't need simply to support families struggling to make ends meet. These interactions carried more meaning for him than any championship belt or monetary reward ever could. During these walks, Manny often reflected on the young fighters he had encountered throughout his career. He remembered each conversation, each piece of advice he had shared, each opportunity to plant seeds of wisdom that might bloom years later. The rejection from Gervonta had become just one of many moments that reminded him how precious and fragile the transfer of knowledge could be between generations. The Filipino champion understood that his role in boxing had evolved beyond competition. His responsibility now involved preserving and sharing the lessons he had learned through triumph and defeat, through moments of glory and periods of doubt. Every young fighter who dismissed his guidance represented a potential loss, not just for their individual development, but for the sport's collective wisdom. Gervonta's voice grew heavier as he described the mounting pressure he felt in subsequent fights. Each victory felt hollow because he knew it could have been achieved more efficiently with proper guidance. Each defensive lapse reminded him of the teachings he had arrogantly rejected. The weight of missed opportunity began affecting his preparation, creating a cycle of self-doubt that no amount of physical training could overcome. The podcast host noticed tears forming in Gervonta's eyes as he continued his revelation. The young champion had built his reputation on fearless aggression and unwavering confidence, but now he was exposing the vulnerability that success had initially hidden. His voice trembled slightly as he described lying awake at night, replaying that moment when he had dismissed Manny's outstretched hand of mentorship. The realization that wisdom, once offered and rejected, might never return had become his most haunting opponent. The podcast studio had become a confessional booth where Gervonta's carefully constructed image continued to crumble with each revealed detail. His promotional team watched nervously from behind the glass partition, understanding that this unprecedented display of vulnerability would forever change how boxing fans perceived their fighter. The revelation was spreading across social media platforms like wildfire, with clips already accumulating millions of views as the boxing community witnessed something they had never seen before. Gervonta's voice grew steadier as he described what happened exactly 1 year after his missed opportunity with Manny. A young fighter from the Philippines named Manny had traveled to the United States for his first major professional bout. The inexperienced boxer, barely 20 years old, carried the hopes of his entire barangay on his shoulders while facing an opponent with significantly more experience and technical skill. 3 days before the fight, Manny's team had received an unexpected phone call. Manny Pacquiao, learning about the young Filipino's upcoming challenge through boxing networks, had personally reached out to offer guidance. Despite his overwhelming schedule of political duties and business commitments, the legendary champion had carved out time to fly from General Santos City to Las Vegas, specifically to spend 2 days working with the nervous young fighter. Gervonta had been training at the same facility during those 2 days, and he watched from a distance as something magical unfolded. Manny arrived at the gym wearing simple training clothes, carrying his own gear bag like any other boxer. He embraced Manny with the warmth of an older brother, immediately putting the young fighter at ease, despite the enormous gap in their achievements and status. The legendary champion spent hours breaking down Manny's technique with infinite patience. He demonstrated footwork patterns that had taken him decades to perfect, sharing the secrets of ring positioning that had allowed him to survive against much larger opponents. More importantly, Manny addressed the mental aspects of competition, teaching the young fighter how to channel nervousness into focused energy. What struck Gervonta most powerfully was witnessing Manny's teaching method. The 8-division champion never presented himself as superior or untouchable. Instead, he shared his own early mistakes and failures, creating a safe space where Bayani could ask questions without fear of judgment. Manny spoke about his first professional losses, about nights when doubt had nearly overwhelmed him, about the importance of learning from every experience regardless of the outcome. During breaks in training, Manny would share simple meals with Bayani and his small team. The legendary boxer insisted on paying for everyone's food while sharing stories about his family, about the values his mother Dionysia had taught him, about staying connected to his roots despite international fame. These conversations carried as much value as the technical instruction, providing life lessons that extended far beyond boxing. Gervonta realized he was witnessing the exact mentorship he had rejected a year earlier. Every piece of advice Manny offered, every technical adjustment he suggested, every word of encouragement he provided, these represented the wisdom that could have transformed Gervonta's own development as both a fighter and a person. The young champion's heart ached as he watched Manny's genuine investment in Bayani's success. There was no cameras capturing these moments, no promotional value for the legendary boxer, no financial compensation for his time and expertise. Manny was simply fulfilling what he saw as his responsibility to the next generation of Filipino fighters, honoring the guidance he had received from his own mentors decades earlier. On fight night, Bayani entered the ring with newfound confidence and technical improvements that seemed impossible after just 2 days of training. Though he ultimately lost a close decision, his performance exceeded all expectations. The young fighter had implemented Manny's teachings flawlessly, displaying ring intelligence and composure that typically took years to develop. After the fight, Manny embraced Bayani with the same warmth he had shown during training, praising his effort and courage while offering continued support for his career development. The legendary champion's reaction to the loss demonstrated something profound about his character. His investment in young fighters transcended immediate results and focused on long-term growth and learning. The podcast studio felt smaller as Gervonta's confession deepened, his words carrying the weight of genuine remorse that resonated through every speaker and headphone connected to the broadcast. Boxing analysts were already comparing this moment to the most honest interviews in sports history, recognizing that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in how modern athletes approach vulnerability and accountability. The young champion's transformation from arrogant dismissal to profound regret was unfolding in real time before millions of listeners. Gervonta's narrative moved to the months following his observation of Manny's work with Bayani. The image of the legendary Filipino champion's patient guidance had burned itself into his memory, creating an obsession with somehow undoing his earlier mistake. He began reaching out through every possible connection in the boxing world, hoping to arrange even a brief meeting with Manny to express his regret and request the mentorship he had so foolishly rejected. The attempts became increasingly desperate as doors continued to close. Promoters explained that Manny's political responsibilities in the Philippines demanded most of his attention. Trainers who had worked with both fighters politely conveyed that the legendary champion's schedule was completely booked for the foreseeable future. Each rejection felt like another layer of consequence for his original arrogance, building a wall between him and the wisdom he now desperately craved. Meanwhile, in the quiet moments between his political duties, Manny often found himself thinking about the young fighters he had encountered throughout his career. During evening walks around his neighborhood in General Santos City, he would pass the small boxing gym where his own journey had begun decades earlier. The facility remained modest and functional, exactly as he preferred it, serving as a reminder of his humble origins and the importance of staying connected to his roots. The legendary champion frequently stopped by this gym to watch local children train, their faces bright with dreams of following in his footsteps. He would quietly observe their techniques, occasionally offering gentle corrections or words of encouragement. These interactions filled him with more satisfaction than any championship victory ever could, representing the true measure of his legacy beyond titles and accolades. Manny's approach to mentorship had been shaped by his own experiences with guidance and rejection throughout his career. He remembered older fighters who had offered wisdom during his early professional years, some of which he had been too proud or impatient to fully appreciate at the time. Those memories taught him that forcing knowledge upon unwilling recipients was futile, and that true learning required genuine humility and openness from both teacher and student. The Filipino champion understood that every rejection he faced from young fighters like Gervonta carried its own lesson. These moments reminded him that wisdom couldn't be imposed through reputation or accomplishment alone. The most valuable teachings could only be received when a fighter's heart was truly ready to embrace growth over ego, learning over knowing, and humility over pride. Gervonta's voice cracked as he described the mounting frustration of his failed attempts to reconnect with Manny. His training began suffering as the psychological weight of missed opportunity interfered with his focus and preparation. Sparring sessions became exercises in self-doubt rather than skill development, with every defensive mistake reminding him of the guidance he had rejected. The young champion started studying Manny's career with obsessive intensity. Watching hundreds of hours of fight footage and interviews, he analyzed every technical detail, every strategic decision, every moment of adversity that the legendary boxer had overcome. This self-imposed education provided valuable insights, but it also highlighted the vast difference between studying greatness from a distance and learning directly from its source. As months passed, Gervonta realized that his pursuit of redemption was becoming its own form of prison. The constant focus on what he had lost was preventing him from fully engaging with what he still had: his talent, his youth, his remaining opportunities for growth. The irony wasn't lost on him that his obsession with Manny's wisdom was actually blocking him from applying the humility that would have made him worthy of receiving it. The podcast had now exceeded its planned duration, but neither the host nor the audience cared about the schedule, as Gervonta's revelation continued to unfold with raw honesty. Boxing forums across the internet buzzed with commentary as fans recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented: a champion voluntarily dismantling his own ego in public. The vulnerability on display challenged every assumption about what it meant to be strong in professional sports. Gervonta's voice took on a different quality as he described a particular evening 18 months after his missed opportunity with Manny. He had been scrolling through social media when he discovered a video that would fundamentally change his perspective on his situation. The clip showed Manny at a small community center in Mindanao, working with a group of amateur boxers who couldn't afford professional training. What struck Gervonta most powerfully was watching Manny interact with a teenager named Isagani, whose attitude mirror reflected his own past arrogance. The young Filipino fighter displayed obvious talent, but carried himself with the same dismissive pride that had characterized Gervonta's behavior in Las Vegas. Throughout the training session, Isagani barely listened to Manny's instructions, rolling his eyes and sighing dramatically whenever the legendary champion offered corrections. Rather than becoming frustrated or walking away, Manny responded with infinite patience and understanding. The video showed him continuing to demonstrate techniques, offer guidance, and provide encouragement despite the teenager's obvious disrespect. Most remarkably, Manny's demeanor never changed. He maintained the same warmth and investment regardless of how his teachings were received. This moment triggered a profound realization for Gervonta about the nature of Manny's character. The legendary Filipino champion wasn't offering mentorship as a favor that could be withdrawn when rejected. Instead, his guidance flowed from a deeper well of compassion and responsibility that transcended individual reactions. Manny taught because teaching was inherent to who he had become, not because he expected gratitude or immediate acceptance. The video also revealed something about Manny's own journey that Gervonta had never considered. During a break in training, the camera captured Manny sharing a quiet moment with one of the gym's older trainers, a weathered man named Dante who had worked with fighters for over 4 decades. Their conversation, though inaudible in the video, suggested a relationship built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Gervonta began researching this relationship, discovering that Dante had been one of Manny's earliest mentors during his teenage years. The older trainer had offered guidance and support when Manny was just beginning his professional journey, but the young fighter hadn't always been receptive to instruction. Pride and impatience had sometimes caused Manny to dismiss advice that he would later recognize as invaluable. This discovery revolutionized Gervonta's understanding of his situation. Manny's willingness to mentor young fighters wasn't born from a place of superiority or natural wisdom. Instead, it emerged from his own experiences with pride, rejection, and the eventual humility that comes from recognizing one's limitations. The legendary champion understood the struggle between ego and growth, because he had lived through it himself. The realization struck Gervonta like a physical blow. Manny hadn't offered mentorship in Las Vegas as someone who had never experienced doubt or arrogance. He had extended that invitation as someone who intimately understood the destructive power of pride and wanted to help others avoid the painful lessons he had learned through experience. In that moment, Gervonta understood that his rejection of Manny's guidance hadn't been a unique failure or an irreversible mistake. It was part of a pattern that the Filipino champion had witnessed countless times throughout his career. More importantly, Manny's continued willingness to mentor young fighters despite frequent rejection demonstrated that redemption was always possible for those willing to embrace genuine humility. The podcast studio fell silent as Gervonta paused, gathering himself for what he clearly knew would be the most difficult part of his confession. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water bottle, the weight of his revelation building toward its inevitable climax. The podcast studio had become a sacred space where truth was being excavated from layers of pride and regret. Gervonta's breathing grew heavier as he approached the heart of his confession, his usual confidence completely stripped away by the weight of genuine vulnerability. The host sat motionless, understanding that any interruption could shatter the fragile courage required for this level of honesty. Across the internet, boxing fans had stopped their normal activities to listen to this unprecedented moment of athletic confession. Gervonta's voice became barely audible as he described what happened 2 years after his rejection of Manny's mentorship. He had suffered a devastating knockout loss that ended his undefeated record and shattered his carefully constructed image of invincibility. The defeat hadn't come from a superior opponent, but from his own technical deficiencies, precisely the kind of fundamental flaws that proper guidance could have addressed years earlier. As he lay unconscious on the canvas, surrounded by medical personnel and the deafening silence of a shocked arena, Gervonta's last conscious thought had been about Manny Pacquiao. In that moment of ultimate vulnerability, his mind had conjured an image of the Filipino legend sitting quietly in that Las Vegas hotel room, waiting for a conversation that would never come. The irony felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He was experiencing the consequences of rejected wisdom while the world watched his downfall. The recovery period that followed became the darkest chapter of Gervonta's career. Medical protocols required extensive rest, but the physical healing paled in comparison to the psychological devastation he endured. Every day brought reminders of what might have been different if he had swallowed his pride during that pivotal moment in Las Vegas. The knockout had exposed fundamental defensive weaknesses that Manny could have identified and corrected years earlier. During those painful weeks of rehabilitation, Gervonta discovered something that completed his understanding of what he had lost. Through a mutual acquaintance, he learned about a conversation Manny had shared with his wife, Jinky, the night after their missed meeting in Las Vegas. The legendary champion had expressed genuine disappointment, not because his ego had been bruised, but because he saw tremendous potential in Gervonta that might go unrealized without proper guidance. Manny had told Jinky about his own experiences with mentorship, describing how the greatest fighters in history had all been shaped by those who came before them. He spoke about his responsibility to pass on not just technical knowledge, but the deeper wisdom about character, humility and perseverance that separated true champions from merely talented athletes. The rejection from Gervonta represented more than a missed opportunity. It symbolized a broken link in the chain of knowledge that connected boxing generations. What devastated Gervonta most was learning that Manny had continued to follow his career despite the rejection. The Filipino champion had watched his fights, celebrated his victories, and felt genuine concern during his struggles. When news of Gervonta's knockout loss reached Manny in the Philippines, he had immediately asked his team to send flowers to the hospital with a simple message of support and encouragement. This act of grace, despite previous rejection, revealed the true depth of Manny's character. The legendary boxer hadn't held grudges or felt vindicated by Gervonta's struggles. Instead, he had maintained the same compassionate concern he would show for any young fighter facing adversity. The flowers represented everything Gervonta had failed to recognize about Manny's nature: his capacity for forgiveness, his genuine investment in others' welfare, his understanding that growth often comes through failure. The podcast studio fell completely silent as Gervonta broke down, his composure finally shattered by the full weight of his revelation. Tears flowed freely as he described opening that hospital room card and reading Manny's words of encouragement. The message had been brief but profound, expressing hope for his recovery and belief in his ability to learn and grow from the experience. In that hospital bed, surrounded by the consequences of his own arrogance, Gervonta had finally understood what he had rejected in Las Vegas. It wasn't just technical instruction or career advice, it was the opportunity to connect with greatness, not through achievement, but through character. Manny's mentorship represented a chance to inherit the wisdom, humility, and compassion that had made him legendary beyond his boxing accomplishments. The podcast studio remained frozen in absolute silence as Gervonta completed his confession, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt at concealment. The host sat speechless, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that would forever change how the boxing world viewed vulnerability, growth, and the true measure of strength. Social media platforms had exploded with millions of reactions as fans around the globe processed this unprecedented display of authentic remorse from a champion. Gervonta's final words carried the weight of complete surrender to truth. He acknowledged that his fatal mistake wasn't simply rejecting a meeting with Manny Pacquiao. It was allowing pride to blind him to an opportunity for profound transformation. The legendary Filipino champion had offered more than technical guidance. He had extended an invitation to inherit the wisdom, humility, and character that define true greatness beyond athletic achievement. The revelation concluded with Gervonta's recognition that this podcast confession itself represented the lesson Manny would have taught him years earlier: the courage to admit error, to expose vulnerability, to prioritize growth over image. These qualities embodied the very humility that had made Manny legendary both inside and outside the ring. In finally learning to set aside his ego, Gervonta was unconsciously applying the wisdom he had rejected. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in General Santos City, Manny was ending another ordinary day with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire post-boxing life. The legendary champion had no knowledge of the podcast revelation happening in Baltimore, but he was living the principles that had driven his offer of mentorship years earlier. His evening walk through familiar neighborhood streets brought him past the small boxing gym where young fighters trained with the same dreams he had once carried. The Filipino champion paused to watch a group of teenagers working on their techniques, their faces bright with ambition and hope. Among them was a young fighter named Wilfredo, whose natural talent was evident, but whose attitude reminded Manny of countless young boxers he had encountered throughout his career. The teenager's swagger and dismissive responses to his trainer's corrections reflected the same pride that Manny himself had once displayed, and that he had recognized in Gervonta during their missed opportunity. Rather than feeling frustrated by the familiar pattern, Manny smiled with understanding and compassion. He knew that wisdom couldn't be forced upon unwilling recipients, and that some lessons could only be learned through experience. His role wasn't to save every young fighter from making mistakes, but to remain available for those who eventually found the courage to seek guidance. The impact of Gervonta's podcast revelation rippled through the boxing community for weeks. Young fighters around the world began reassessing their own attitudes toward mentorship and guidance from previous generations. The confession sparked conversations about the importance of humility in athletic development and the true meaning of strength in professional sports. Most significantly, the revelation demonstrated that redemption was always possible for those willing to embrace genuine growth. Gervonta's public acknowledgement of his mistake represented the exact kind of character development that Manny had hoped to nurture years earlier. The lesson had been learned, albeit through a longer and more painful path than necessary. In the end, Manny Pacquiao's greatest victory wasn't achieved in any boxing ring. It was the quiet triumph of character over ego, wisdom over pride, and compassion over judgment. His willingness to offer guidance without expectation of acceptance had planted seeds that eventually blossomed into growth, even when that growth came through rejection and subsequent realization. The fatal mistake had become a profound lesson, proving that true champions are defined not by their ability to avoid errors, but by their courage to acknowledge them and grow from the experience. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.